I know if you saw the title of this video, it said villains. I know he's not a villain. I'll get into him and other characters like him eventually and why they're cool conceptually. But if you're watching this, of course, you're here because villains. We all, I'm not going to say love them, because, I mean, kind of the point of them. It's more that you love to hate them. This whole video is just about why they're important to a story, why you need a good villain, why you need a good antagonist that's good to hate, and why would you want that? I'm going to go through a couple of examples and go through examples like this guy here, who were villains at one point, or and are now there's something else. Some quick examples of who I'm going to talk about, and stories in general I'll talk about. Oh, I will definitely mention examples. Star Wars with like characters like Darth Vader. I'm going to mention for literature, I'm going to mention Professor Moriarty, the villain of Sherlock Holmes. Pretty important literal villain in literature. And then I will definitely mention as well some Batman villains who are also important characters. Then two pieces I'm going to bring up in against my whole thing about needing a true villain are The Odyssey and Encanto from Disney, who they're both pieces of media I would say don't. Let's begin with what constitutes a good villain and why it's important for a story. A villain is what makes the story a story. Without the villain, there's no conflict. And really, to start off with, saying any villain is a good villain on their own isn't always necessarily true. Most villains are only good villains because they fit their story, because they are the source of the story. A good, very popular example of a villain being a perfect fit of the story and creating the conflict of the story is someone like Thanos from the Avengers. He's a good villain for the Avengers because he's a big enough issue to warrant getting all of them together. He fits the story because he's the reason they all have to become the Avengers again. And so that is a good reason for him to be there. And that goes hand in hand with the idea that without him, there's no reason for them to, be the Avengers. Without Thanos, there's no conflict. Without Thanos, there is no Avengers. He is the instigator. Without him, there is no story. Simple. Really shift back to what makes a villain a good villain. Really, in the public consciousness, what makes a good villain has kind of shifted. As I stated, they of course have always really needed to fit the story, but that's more accurate now than it has been. They've really evolved with our tastes in storytelling. The older villains were more often just villains to be villains. They just wanted to be evil. But now villains usually have a reason to be evil in their backstory, which just gives them more depth, more reason to be who they are. And that can be imperative to the story. Some stories wouldn't really work if the villain didn't have some backstory that justified, or maybe not justified, but at least to give us context to who they are. Some examples of villains who exhibit the before, being where they're just evil to be evil, are some of the early Disney villains like Gaston or like Maleficent. One is evil just to be evil, that being Maleficent, and Gaston is just kind of, for a lack of better terms, just weirdly horny. I don't know how to make that. Since I brought up Maleficent, it would be good to mention that she has shifted into the after part with the Maleficent movies, giving her a new backstory and a reason for being who she is. Two more villains like her that gain complexity as time passed are some that I mentioned at the start of the video, those being Professor Moriarty and Darth Vader again. In Moriarty's case, he started off as kind of a generic evil serial killer that kind of popped up over again and again for Sherlock Holmes to investigate. However, as time has now passed, He's more of like an actual nemesis, where he's just trying to break him. He's trying to create a case that Sherlock Holmes can't beat. It has a backstory in most cases for why he is like this, even though in the original Sherlock Holmes novels, he was just kind of just a serial killer. Darth Vader is in the original movies and how they progressed. Kind of, he started out as just generic evil villain trying to stop the bad guys. He was always threatening, but he didn't really have a story. He was just like, oh, this guy's the big like one of the big top bad guys in this evil empire. So that's all we knew. But as time went on, he kind of grew. We learned more about him. We kind of found out that he was kind of a sort of dark mirror of our main guy, Luke, who got shaped, his mind shaped, and got his ideas from this evil emperor guy. And, well, other complexity being, spoiler alert, he's Luke's dad, which kind of we didn't know at the beginning, so that gives him more backstory, evidently. Without these characters, there wouldn't be conflict in those projects. They're so incredibly intertwined with what project stands for. At least some of them not beginning, like Moriarty wasn't exactly imperative. They didn't need to have him in every story. But now they kind of go hand in hand with whatever you're talking about. Like, you can't have Star Wars without Darth Vader. You can't have Batman without the Joker. You need these characters so a story can happen. And it really is kind of just this idea of you need them. I'm now going to circle over to a small tangent about characters who started as villains, then for one reason or another aren't really anymore. One example to start things off is this guy. That is the Red Hood. And he was really one of the sidekicks of Batman, actually. He died at one point in comics, and when he got revived, he ended up being evil, kind of. It was weird. Eventually, due to popularity and other outside factors, the writers redeemed him, and he now sits in the weird nebulous zone of being an anti-hero. These, of course, being people who fight for good, but do bad to do so. Some other examples of villains growing out of villainy are characters like Venom and Magneto from Marvel Comics. A character like Venom grew into a hero out of sheer just popularity. People like him, people liked him enough that the writers were just like, let's have him be an anti-hero. People have more reason to like him. People will buy more comics. Magneto, however, sits in a different category altogether. He was always a character in a story that represented fighting racism. And he fought for the rights of people that were treated as second-class citizens, those being, in Marvel Comics, the mutants. He was literally a Holocaust survivor in his backstory. He grew into a more heroic position because as time passed, it just got harder for writers to write him as a villain, just because of what he was doing. This does make a lot of sense since, he's fighting for civil rights, albeit in his earlier depictions, a lot more violently and villainous, which, that kind of was why he was a villain. Um, Characters like these just show how a good story making villain can get so good that they spin off into a story of their own, with them as the protagonist. A villain can just be so imperative to a story, so good at making the story, that people are like, I like them so much, or they are so like to this point, they're just to this point where the writers realize they could do even better as a main character. That's such a good villain. They ended up growing to the status of no longer the villain, which in a lot of cases is quite crazy. In just being that they were meant to be the bad guy. There are some pretty obvious counterpoints to my argument about villains being necessary for a good story. Some stories with no real main villain during the driving the plot are, for example, The Odyssey and Encanto. I would, however, say that they don't have a traditional villain, but they still have either a villain or a villainous force driving the plot forward. I'm going to start with Encanto. Uh, Encanto's villain is it's pretty evident what they're trying to go for as the villain or villainous force from the start. Encanto's villain, or villain in this case, is generational trauma. In Encanto, the entire idea is that the main character has to fix the problems that her family has due to how they were all raised, going all the way back up to her grandmother. The trauma that the grandmother suffered and that she has pushed onto her children is depicted as being defeated near the end of the film, signifying to me at least that is the villain of the movie. On a completely different note, you have the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, it's not really far-fetched to say that you yourself are kind of viewing it from the eyes of the main villain, Odysseus himself. The entire plot is triggered by Odysseus being cocky and taunting the Cyclops Polyphemus, while almost every single other bad event that happens in the whole story is in some way usually still his fault. He may be the protagonist, but he's definitely also kind of the villain of his own story. These two examples to me kind of show either a subversion with Odysseus or a more ethereal villain with Encanto. They both, however, in my mind, still have a villain that is defeated by the end, either that being defeating the generational trauma or Odysseus growing into a different, better person. Without these villains, the stories wouldn't work. Would Encanto work if the family was perfectly healthy from the get go? And would the Odyssey work if Odysseus was more like the end of the story version of himself from the very beginning? With that, my video is coming to an end. I hope you all have, by this point, agree with me on the necessity of a villain in a story. Whether said villain be physical, mental, or no longer a villain. Villains are and always will be the glue that holds the plot of a story together. I won't keep you all any longer. Thank you for watching, and hey, if this is a even if this is a pretty terrible first video, it would mean a lot to me if I could get even a few likes or subscribers. Maybe? Goodbye, and hopefully I will see some of you all again soon.